Hi, I'm Jack, and this is the story of how an unexpected encounter at an airport changed my life forever. What started as a chance meeting with a stranger, Mike, during a trip to see the Northern Lights, became something so much more, a journey of love, self-discovery, and bravery under the vast, frozen skies. What would you do if life surprised you in the most unexpected way? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more unforgettable stories like this one. The airport terminal was a sea of movement, filled with the buzz of announcements and the chatter of travelers. I clutched my coffee tightly, the warmth a small comfort against the early morning chill. My flight to Tromsø, Norway, was boarding in an hour, and I was equal parts excited and nervous. Seeing the Northern Lights had been a dream of mine for years, a bucket list item that I was finally checking off. As I scanned the departure board, my eyes caught on someone standing a few feet away. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with short brown hair and a rugged look that suggested he was no stranger to adventure. He was fiddling with his ticket, looking just as tired as I felt. "Excuse me," he said suddenly, turning toward me. His voice was deep but friendly. "Is this the right gate for Tromsø?" I nodded. "Yeah, gate 14. Heading to see the Northern Lights, too?" He smiled, a hint of relief in his expression. "Yeah, been planning this trip for a while now. Thought I'd finally make it happen." "Same here," I said, offering my hand. "I'm Jack." "Mike," he replied, shaking it firmly. We started talking, and within minutes, it felt like we'd known each other for years. He told me he was from Seattle, worked as an engineer, and had always wanted to see the aurora borealis. I shared that I was a photographer from Chicago, hoping to capture the lights on camera. As we boarded the plane and found our seats, coincidentally next to each other, we kept talking. The conversation flowed easily, from our favorite travel destinations to our families. We even laughed about how we were both leaving our wives at home for this solo adventure. "It's funny," Mike said at one point, leaning back in his seat. "This was supposed to be a trip to clear my head, but it's nice to have someone to talk to." "I get that," I said, nodding. "Sometimes it feels like you need to get away to really think." The flight passed quickly, and before we knew it, we were descending into Tromsø. The landscape outside the window was breathtaking: snow-covered mountains, icy fjords, and endless white plains. After landing, we grabbed our luggage and headed to the rental car counter. It turned out we were both planning to drive to the same remote campsite known for its stunning views of the Northern Lights. "You know," Mike said, grinning, "since we're going to the same place, maybe we should carpool, save on gas and all that." I hesitated for a moment, but his easy smile made the decision for me. "Sure, why not?" We loaded our bags into the small SUV and hit the road. The drive was surreal, with snow-dusted trees lining the winding roads and the faint glow of twilight lingering on the horizon. When we arrived at the campsite, the cold hit us like a slap. It was well below freezing, and the wind cut through our jackets like a knife. As we set up our tents, Mike glanced over at me and said, "You sure you're ready for this? It's going to be a long, cold night." I laughed, my breath visible in the icy air. "I think I'll survive. What about you?" He smirked. "Guess we'll find out." That night, as we settled into our separate tents, I couldn't help but feel a strange connection to Mike. It wasn't just that we'd spent hours talking, it was something deeper, something I couldn't quite put into words. Little did I know, the Northern Lights weren't the only thing that would take my breath away on this trip. The first night at the campsite was colder than I expected. The temperature dipped so low that even inside my tent, bundled up in layers of clothes and my sleeping bag, I couldn't stop shivering. The thought of Mike just a few feet away in his own tent somehow brought me a strange sense of comfort. The following day, we spent our time exploring the frozen landscape. Mike had an easygoing nature that made everything feel more fun, even as we struggled through the snow to set up cameras and search for clear skies. His laughter echoed through the cold air, and I found myself smiling more than I had in weeks. By late afternoon, thick clouds rolled in, and the wind picked up. The sky promised no clear view of the aurora that night. We decided to set up a small fire near the tents and eat what little food we had brought. "Looks like Mother Nature isn't cooperating," Mike said, poking at the fire with a stick. "Yeah, but there's still time," I replied. "We've got a few more nights." He nodded, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. "So, Jack, why did you really come out here? Don't get me wrong, the Northern Lights are amazing, but trips like this, they're usually about more than just the scenery." I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I guess I just needed a break," I said finally. "Life back home feels complicated." Mike chuckled softly. "Tell me about it." "What about you?" I asked, curious. He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. "Same, I guess. My wife and I, we've been growing apart. I thought maybe this trip would give me some clarity, help me figure out what I want." His honesty surprised me, and I felt a pang of understanding. It's not easy, is it? Trying to figure out where you stand in your own life. He looked at me then, his eyes searching mine. "No, it's not." The moment lingered, the air between us heavy with something unspoken. But before I could say anything, the wind picked up and the fire sputtered out. "Guess that's our cue to call it a night," Mike said, standing up and brushing off the snow. Back in my tent, I couldn't shake the memory of the way he'd looked at me. It wasn't just the words he'd said, it was the way he said them, like he was speaking directly to something I hadn't even admitted to myself yet. Around midnight, the wind howled outside, rattling the tents. I couldn't sleep, the cold seeping into my bones despite the layers of blankets and clothing. Finally, I unzipped my tent and stepped out, braving the freezing air. Mike was already outside, his breath visible in the frosty night. He looked up as I approached, his expression softening. "Couldn't sleep?" "Too cold," I admitted. He nodded toward his tent. "It's bigger than yours. If you want, we could share. Body heat helps." I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Yeah, that sounds practical." Inside his tent, the space was tight, forcing us to lie close together. The warmth was immediate, and I could feel the tension in my body begin to melt away. "Thanks for this," I said quietly. "Any time," he replied, his voice just as soft. The silence stretched out, but it wasn't uncomfortable. In the quiet, under layers of blankets, our shoulders touched, and I could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. I don't know who moved first, but suddenly, our faces were inches apart. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, the world outside the tent seemed to disappear. "Jack," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. And then, before I could second-guess myself, I closed the distance between us. The kiss started softly, hesitant, as if neither of us was sure this was real. But then, something shifted. The tension that had been building between us since we met finally broke, and the kiss deepened. The cold air outside the tent disappeared, replaced by a heat I hadn't felt in years. Mike pulled back slightly, his breath shaky. "Are we really doing this?" he whispered, his forehead resting against mine. I didn't have an answer, not one that made sense. All I knew was that in that moment, nothing else mattered. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I don't want to stop." He nodded, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Me neither." What followed was a blur of hands and lips, a desperate need to close the distance between us. It wasn't just physical, it was emotional, raw, and unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Every touch felt electric, every whispered word a confession. By the time we finally lay back, tangled in the blankets, the first light of dawn was creeping through the tent. Neither of us spoke for a long time, the reality of what had just happened settling over us. "Jack," Mike said softly, breaking the silence. "Yeah? I don't know what this means," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Me neither," I replied honestly. "But I know it feels right." He turned to look at me, his expression vulnerable. "I don't know what happens when we leave this place, but I know I don't want this to be the end." I reached out, taking his hand in mine. "Then let's not think about that right now. Let's just be here." He nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Okay." That day, we didn't leave the campsite. Instead, we stayed close, talking about everything and nothing. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I could be completely myself. No walls, no masks, just me. As night fell again, the skies finally cleared, and the aurora borealis painted the heavens in shimmering hues of green and purple. We stood together under the vast, frozen sky, our breaths visible in the frigid air. "It's beautiful," Mike said, his voice filled with awe. "So are you," I replied, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He turned to me, his cheeks reddening, not from the cold, but from the compliment. "You're not so bad yourself," he said, a playful smirk on his lips. In that moment, under the northern lights, everything felt perfect. The next morning, the air felt lighter. Mike and I shared quiet smiles as we packed our gear, the silence between us comfortable, even intimate. The memory of the previous night lingered, etched into my mind like a vivid dream. We spent the day hiking through the snowy expanse, occasionally stopping to take photos or just take in the view. The northern lights had been everything I'd imagined and more, but they weren't the only thing that had taken my breath away. "You're quiet today," Mike said as we stopped for a break. "Just thinking," I replied, looking out at the endless white horizon. "About last night?" I turned to him, surprised by his honesty. "Yeah. You?" He nodded, his expression serious. "Jack, I don't know what this is. I mean, we both have lives waiting for us back home, and this wasn't supposed to happen." "I know," I said softly. "But it did." "And now what?" he asked, his voice tinged with uncertainty. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "I don't have all the answers, Mike, but I know I don't regret it. Do you?" He shook his head, his eyes meeting mine. "No, I don't." That evening, back at the campsite, we sat by the fire, the glow of the flames dancing in his eyes. The conversation turned lighter, and we laughed about the little mishaps of the trip, the time we got lost on the trail, the food that froze solid overnight. But beneath the laughter was an unspoken understanding. What we'd shared wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was real, and it mattered. Later, as we lay side by side in the tent, Mike broke the silence. "I don't know how we make this work," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "We figure it out," I said, reaching for his hand. "One step at a time." He squeezed my hand, his warmth grounding me in a way I hadn't felt before. "Okay," he said simply. The last night of our trip arrived faster than I wanted. The realization that we'd soon be returning to our separate lives felt like a weight pressing down on my chest. The snow outside fell steadily, blanketing the campsite in silence as Mike and I sat by the fire, lost in thought. "This feels surreal," Mike said, breaking the quiet. I nodded. It does. Like we've been living in a bubble, away from everything. But the bubble pops tomorrow, he said, his voice tinged with sadness. I swallowed hard, the thought of leaving him almost unbearable. What if it doesn't have to? He looked at me, his eyes searching mine. Jack, we both have lives waiting for us. Responsibilities. People who expect us to come back unchanged. And maybe that's the problem, I said, leaning forward. Maybe those lives aren't what we really want. I can't speak for you, Mike, but I know that being here with you, it's the first time I've felt alive in years. His jaw tightened and he looked away, his expression conflicted. It's not that simple. I know it's not, I said, my voice soft. But I also know that what we have is worth fighting for. The fire crackled between us, the only sound in the otherwise still night. Finally, he turned back to me, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. I don't know if I'm brave enough for this, he admitted. You are, I said firmly, reaching for his hand. And so am I. We don't have to have all the answers right now, but we can figure it out together. For a long moment, he didn't speak. But then, slowly, he nodded. Okay, he said, his voice barely audible. We spent that night in each other's arms, whispering promises and dreams into the quiet. It wasn't a solution, but it was a start. The morning of our departure came with a bitter chill that had nothing to do with the weather. The snow-covered ground crunched beneath our boots as Mike and I packed the last of our things into the car. Neither of us spoke much. The weight of reality hung heavily in the cold, crisp air. The drive back to the airport was quiet. The once easy conversation between us had been replaced by long silences and stolen glances. I wanted to say something, to assure him that this wasn't the end, but the words felt stuck in my throat. As we reached the rental car return, Mike finally broke the silence. You're flying back to Chicago, right? Yeah, I said, forcing a small smile. And you're heading to Seattle? He nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line. It feels weird, doesn't it? Going back to normal after everything. It doesn't have to be normal, I replied, my voice firmer than I expected. He glanced at me, his expression conflicted. What do you mean? I mean, we don't have to pretend this didn't happen. We don't have to go back to being the people we were before. We can... I hesitated, taking a deep breath. We can keep this. And how do we do that, Jack? He asked, his voice cracking. We live thousands of miles apart. We're married. We've built lives that don't leave room for this. I looked at him, searching his face for some hint of hope. Maybe those lives aren't the ones we're meant to live. Maybe this, what we found here, is the life we're supposed to fight for. His jaw tightened, and he looked away, staring out at the planes on the tarmac. It's not that simple. Nothing worth having ever is, I said, stepping closer. For a moment he didn't move. Then he turned to me, his eyes glassy with unshed tears. Jack, I want to believe that we can make this work, but I don't know if I'm strong enough to tear apart everything I've built. I reached out, taking his hands in mine. You don't have to do it alone, Mike. Whatever happens, we'll figure it out together. But I can't go back to pretending this didn't happen. Not after everything. He looked down at our hands, his thumb brushing over my knuckles. You're right, he said softly. I can't either. Relief and hope flooded through me, but it was bittersweet. We still didn't have a plan, and the road ahead felt impossibly daunting. But for the first time, I felt like we had a chance, a real chance, to make something of this. At the airport gate, we stood together in the bustling crowd, our connection a quiet contrast to the chaos around us. "This isn't goodbye," I said, my voice steady. "No," Mike agreed, his lips curving into a small smile. "It's just, see you later." We hugged, the embrace lasting longer than it should have, and when we pulled apart, his eyes met mine one last time. "Take care of yourself, Jack," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You too, Mike," I replied. As we boarded our separate flights, I felt a strange mix of sadness and hope. The pain of leaving him was sharp, but it was tempered by the knowledge that this wasn't the end of our story. Months passed, and life at home felt different. My wife and I had a long, painful conversation about where our marriage was heading, and in the end, we both agreed that it was time to part ways. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Mike and I kept in touch, texts, calls, and late-night video chats that felt like lifelines. Slowly, the miles between us began to feel smaller, the possibility of a future together more real. One day, months after our trip, I stood at the arrivals gate in Seattle. My heart pounded as I scanned the crowd, and then I saw him. Mike walked toward me, his bag slung over his shoulder, and that same nervous smile on his face. "You came," I said, my voice trembling. "I told you it wasn't goodbye," he replied, pulling me into a hug that felt like coming home. Under the bright lights of the airport, surrounded by the hum of strangers, we started the next chapter of our story. A story built on the courage to embrace the unexpected and the belief that love was worth fighting for. What would you do if love found you in the most unexpected place and changed everything you thought you knew about yourself? Would you have the courage to fight for it, even if it meant leaving behind the life you've built? Or would fear hold you back from embracing what could be the most meaningful connection of your life? Tell us in the comments. Your voice matters. What did you think of Jack and Mike's journey? Did their story inspire you or make you reflect on your own relationships? Don't forget to like this video if it moved you, share it with someone who might need to hear this story, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible, heartfelt tales. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a story that could change the way you see love, life, and yourself. Stay tuned, because the next story might just speak to your heart in ways you never expected. Thank you for watching.